Swing and a miss. Struck him out. The Philadelphia Phillies are 2008 World Champions of Baseball.
And the Sixers win it! Wow!
Oh man, Embiid just posterized Russell Westbrook.
You love the Philadelphia Eagles. Let me get a hell yeah!
Yo, what is up, guys? It is Deibs, Mr. Crackpot on Twitter. Welcome to Party on Broad. The Party on Broad podcast can be found on iTunes and Spotify. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you comment below. Did you like the podcast? What are your thoughts? We want to hear from you guys. Joining me today is my man Tyson. Follow him on Twitter at Quibel Tyson. What up, man?
Not much. Excited to talk about the Flyers and especially the young talent because it is rich right now.
Super, super rich. And today we are talking about Tyson's number one prospect on the Philadelphia Flyers, and that is my man, Ivan Provorov. Today we're going to do a season review. We're going to talk about his last year's season. We're going to grade it, and then we're going to kind of move into future outlook and what we expect. How good can Provy be moving forward? All right, let's get this started. In seasons past, Provy showed glimpses and flashes of what he could become. In 2020, Provy took a huge step forward, cementing himself as one of the top up-and-comers in the NHL. Tyson, talk to us a little bit about Ivan Provorov this past season.
Yeah, so he had a huge step forward compared to the previous season and a slight in comparison to the season before that. So, in other words, he came in as a 19-year-old in that really rich 2015 draft, the Connor McDavid, Jack Eichel draft. He went in the top 10. I remember watching him frequently when he was 16, 17 years old when he played on the Brandon Wheat Kings. And you just watch him kind of take over games with his pace, his puck control. You're kind of like, wait, is he a forward right now? Like just dominant, overall dominant. And so there wasn't a surprise there when he went, at pick second year there in the NHL as a 20-year-old, scored 17 goals, 41 points. He looked like it was just going to be this steady incline. And then the Flyers had that fall off year under Dave Haxtell, and it was a big fall off year. And it just ended up being kind of a disaster, and he was kind of at the front of that. So his offense took a big hit. His defensive play took a big hit. He had a lot of different defensive partners, a lot of volatility. And then this year, again, he had consistency with Matt Niskanen. So the Flyers bringing in Matt Niskanen, a veteran in his early 30s who's been in every possible situation in the league. Suddenly there's some stability there. Suddenly Provorov seems to have the confidence to go play offensively and not feel like he's going to get reamed out by his coach for his failures defensively because his partner is very aware and knows what's going on. And so Niskanen also had a good season. He very much benefited from playing from Provorov. And so if you look at him in this season in particular, he kind of started back again on that linear progression. And so defensemen always take longer to develop. It is rare that you see a defenseman hit his prime offensive years, for example, or his prime overall play by the time he's 22, 23. And so obviously we're kind of doing players 24 and under. And so he's barely on that cutoff, but it may still be 2 to 3 years before we see him hit his best year or best years. And it may be as soon as a year, it might start next year, but it may take a couple more. And so that's all good signs in particular because especially in the playoffs this year, he's playing 25 minutes a night. He looked incredible in moments. He's a star. And we see it.
All right. I loved how you brought up Matt Niskanen because that kind of leads into my next question. There were times last season when Al Morganti called this guy the adult in the room. Even though this guy's only 23 years old, man. Do you see Provy becoming one of the main leaders of the locker room for the Flyers moving forward?
I think he could be. I think sometimes a knock on Russian players, unfortunately so, is that, there's language barriers or maybe they're more enigmatic in personality. That's been proven to be unfounded for the most part, but for some reason it still prevents clubs sometimes from drafting or putting in players in leadership positions. But he came over here at 16 to play in Canada, so he was committed to, I think this is the best path for me to make the NHL. And he was in leadership roles and he was on the Wheat Kings and Brandon at a young age. And so, yeah, I could very much see that going forward. And especially if you're someone who consistently leads by example. I mean, he's a player that they'll look up to frequently to rely on for both offense and defense and to set the pace of games. And I think that's going to continue. So, yeah, I could definitely see him maybe – I don't think he's wearing a letter yet, but in future years for sure wearing a letter, at least like an A.
Awesome. Before we get to future outlook, man, how would you grade Ivan Provorov's season in 2019-2020?
Yeah, so I gave him a B+. I borderline on the A- B+, and I'm giving a letter grade. So it was one of those ones where, like, in terms of counting stats, like he had 36 points, so 13 goals, a good amount of goals again for a defenseman. I mean, the fact that a player his age has already had 2 10-plus goal seasons is pretty incredible. And so I didn't have an issue so much with counting stats. His underlying numbers were pretty good too in comparison to previous years. But I think like there's just a little bit more we'd like to see from him. Like we see the wow factor in his game, and there's moments in games when we see that wow factor where he kind of looks like he could take it over from the back end. Or perhaps like there's times when you think like, man, I don't know how he misses that coverage occasionally, or struggles to transition in the neutral zone on defense. And there's moments when you see that when you're like, man, you got to remind yourself he's only 23, because you're like, okay, like if all the tools come together, I see him doing this, and here he's like here. So it's not like a huge gap, but it's enough of a gap still that you're kind of like, okay, I still see with more consistency, you could be this. And so I gave him a B+ for that, but he did have an excellent playoff too. I mean, he was very noticeable. 25 minutes a game for a defenseman that young.
Wow.
This is the playoffs of young defensemen. Quinn Hughes on Vancouver, Cale Makar, Colorado, Miro Heiskanen is tearing it up for Dallas. He's 21. He's insane. Set a record for most assists in like a series in the first round. He had 10 assists in the first round. So we're getting there. But Provorov is in the mix of those young defenders. So it's a really good thing to see. And so, yeah, B+. I don't think that's bad. But I didn't have him as like a, yay, your perfect season. It's like you had a really good season.
As a huge like Eagles and Sixers fan, it's so fun to see, players take that next step in their development. You see it in the Eagles, like Derek Barnett, Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid, Carson Wentz. There are things, fundamentals, parts of the game that they continue to just not, they're just not getting it, 4, 5, 6 years into the league. So huge expectations for Mr. Ivan Provorov. And let's talk about future outlook. Right before training camp started last season, Ivan signed a 6-year deal worth $6.75 million annually. Like, what are some areas important for Ivan Provorov to continue his development into one of the young stars of the NHL?
I think in many ways it's confidence. Like some of the difficulty with defensemen like him, where he is very offensive minded, is especially as you're getting used to the NHL game. Like when he was in junior, like expectations from coach would be like, okay, you're a defenseman, you have the puck, just carry it, just go. Like in terms of like, I don't necessarily have to think about defense, or the defense that I'm playing is reactionary, not systems based. So they do systems, don't get me wrong, but a player of his caliber in general, a coach at that level is going to be more worried about players playing in systems that will never reach the NHL level. So a guy like him, he could just fly back and forth, like do what he wants, carry the puck in the zone. If he gets caught in defense, whatever, he'll probably catch up half the time because he's faster than half the players. NHL transition, so much of it is suddenly everybody is playing in a system, right? There's very few players in the league that just have that full leash to say, screw the system, you can do what you want. And so for a player like him, so much of what he does at the NHL level is a combination of him figuring out when to engage offensively and when he needs to watch for that player that is just snuck behind him, right?
Yep.
And so that's the confidence that comes with age, especially on defense, is you don't have the puck as often as forwards do very often. So you have to be very aware of your surroundings defensively and offensively. And so for him, I think it's just going to be continued confidence. And we'll see that the more comfortable he is in the league, the more often we'll see him make the right decisions of carrying the puck in the offensive zone or making that big offensive play, and yet still at the same time being aware enough defensively to not put his team at risk. And so I think he's still in that transition period of figuring that out, but he can do it. It's just going to take some time. And that would put him in an upper echelon of players in the league. I think of defensemen that do that well now, like he's had a couple. He's on a bad team, but Drew Doughty still does that fairly well on LA. You know, that's an example of that. Roman Yossi hitting his prime on that in Nashville, and there's obviously a lot more than that. But those are two examples. I mean, the contract is stellar, honestly.
Yeah.
6.75. I was just looking at that again today, and I was like, wait, he has 5 years left. It was a little questionable at the time because he had a bad season there in his third season in the league, and it was like, that's a risk. If he has another one of these, it's not going to look good. But now it looks like a bargain. So, yep.
Whew, sky's the limit for Ivan Provorov. Talking about next year, what are your quick expectations for Ivan Provorov for next season?
Yeah, I think the expectation would be he takes that step forward. So he grows in confidence. Niskanen will be back. So he'll have a second year with that same top pairing. Now, obviously, the coach might switch that up. I think it's unlikely because it worked really well. It was their most consistent pairing overall with underlying numbers and counting stats throughout the year. So I think they're going to continue to do that. And so I think, if anything, his confidence is just going to soar. And so I think that a step going forward for him is breaking the 50-point barrier for a defenseman, which will be huge. Like, I remember his draft year, everyone was saying, like, already we see him as a potential Norris Trophy candidate, you know, best defenseman in the league. I think we start seeing him heading more in that direction. So we start looking at him less so as he's this really good young defenseman. If everything comes together, we're taking a step forward. He starts hitting the first step towards hitting his prime and putting him in that upper echelon of the league in defense. So, which is why on my list, some people might be surprised Carter Hart's not there. It's not that I don't like Carter Hart. I just think that Provorov still has a higher ceiling on the franchise. So that's my thought anyway.
All right. That is Tyson Quibell. Follow him on Twitter at Quibell Tyson. Dude, anything you want to plug?
Yeah, I have been reworking my draft rankings and mock drafts for way too long. I feel like I'm always saying this. I'm just reworking and changing days from today. And so hopefully those things will all be completed throughout the weekend in anticipation for this crazy draft, which will be done on Zoom October 6th and 7th. And the Flyers do have a pick. They're picking, I believe, 23rd. So at this given time. So, and they have a first and a second. So unless they move it, the likelihood is that they will have a decent pick in a very deep draft. So if you're curious as to who they might get at that position, both my rankings and a mock draft will be out very, very quickly here. So you can reference that.
Awesome. And I also had Tyson join us. We did I think the top 10 prospects in the NHL draft. So if you're a draft junkie here at the Painted Lines YouTube channel, you can check all those guys out. We talked about their strengths, weaknesses, all the above. Best fits in the NHL. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you follow all of Tyson's content here at thepaintedlines.com. For Tyson, for myself, thanks for watching, guys. Stay awesome.
Sixers win it! Wow!
Oh man, and being just posterized, Russell Westbrook.
You love the